Hi, welcome to this March 2022 Conveyancing Matters News Review.
Welcome to Conveyancing Matters with Lorraine and Stu. Join us for a chat about all things property.
So, hello, Mr. Forsdyke. How the hell are you?
I'm very good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm all right, thanks. You always say that, bit English, isn't it? I always say I'm all right over COVID. So, but it wasn't very bad, to be fair. So, yeah, I'm all right now, Stu. Thanks, mate.
So you're not in your pajamas anymore, then?
I'm afraid I do have my pajama bottoms on. But let's not tell anyone, Stu. Nobody will watch this, so it's fine. They won't know. So, so March 2022 Conveyancing News Review, Stu, as ever, just for the, the one person that hasn't watched this before, let's just explain. We do a bit of a sort of roundup at the end of each month on, things that have interested you and I in the sort of conveyancing arena. I mean, there's always lots going on. So what we're going to do is just sort of, pick the things that we think are of particular interest to conveyancers at the coalface too. So we've had a budget since we last had a chat. So so what's your view? What's your takeaway on the budget?
Well, what was in it? Not a lot, was there, for us?
Property lawyers.
No, exactly. So I suppose over the last sort of couple of years, with any announcements, we've been at the forefront, haven't we? But not this time. Nothing really in the budget of any note was there. I suppose the only link really maybe into our sphere is probably the cost of living now, with everything going up, and is that going to have an effect on the market?
Yeah, I mean, we have talked about this before, haven't we? And our lovely friend Russell Quirk was quite bullish about this, and didn't think it would have an impact. And Russell probably knows more than I do. Well, I mean, very sure knows more than I do. But I couldn't help thinking, Stu, that sort of later in the year, and I absolutely don't want to talk the market down, but equally I think we have to be realistic about this stuff. I can't help thinking that later in the year, fuel prices are definitely going up. Whether or not that's going to, have a sort of downward impact on the market. I mean, just to sort of pick up on another, sort of property fact, what's come out in the last sort of month or so is the fact that house prices apparently are still high. There was according to the UK House Prices Index from the ONS and the Land Reg, house growth was at 9.6% in January 2022, which is still high. But Stu, are you sort of? I mean, there's also talk, isn't there, about things slowing down. I mean, are you seeing that at the moment at all? No, it's
not at all. No, I wonder whether I personally thought the first sort of quarter of this year there would be a bit of a dip. It would be slightly quieter, nothing drastic, but slightly quieter. Don't seem to have seen that in the southeast particularly. I also wonder whether sort of last year, with the stamp duty holiday, not only did people take advantage of it, but maybe it's conditioned people to sort of focus on what they want to do in the future, and i.e. save up to buy. And maybe we're actually now living off that. People have actually managed to save money over the last few years, and they're now in a position to buy, maybe not in time to save the stamp duty, but this year.
Yeah.
So I wonder whether we're just going to sort of eke out this year of, lots of growth still, and lots of demand. And I think that's probably where we sit with it.
Yeah, I mean, I hope for the sake of the market you do. I mean, and what's interesting is that, I'm hearing, from the firms I either train for or locum for, Stu, and I mean, I'm hearing that, there really isn't any sort of meaningful slowdown at all. I mean, there are, according to the Building Society Association reports, that there are some sort of headwinds, and they sort of talk about prices falling, which actually, in a way, perhaps might not be a bad thing, might sort of stimulate the market further, really, if that's the case.
Of course.
I mean, I also thought, just as a sort of slight sort of budget detour, I mean, there's always talk about sort of stamp duty, land tax before any budget, isn't there? And
of course.
What I thought was sort of slightly odd is that people were speculating about whether, elements of SDLT would go up again, which I thought was probably unlikely. But what I saw reported that I just thought was, well, odd, is there a couple of reports that said, buyers and members of the public think that stamp duty land tax is a jolly bad idea and jolly ought to be reformed. Stamp duty land tax ought to be replaced. And I thought, well, anybody that's got to pay a chunk of money when they purchase, of course they're going to say that. Is that likely? No. When you look at the stamp duty land tax receipts that the Treasury got last year, you know, are they going to kill that cash cow? No. So was that a story? No. I just thought, I don't know. Is it me? Am I getting old? Yes.
It's different, you know. It's always going to be there. It's whether it obviously does need reform, doesn't it? It's whether you could have, you know, sort of more marginalised brackets with different percentages. You know, I always wonder why it goes from, you know, that steep jump from 1 to 3. You know, no sort of intermediate bracket. You know, where's the 2% gone? But I think there's also that sort of train of thought, isn't there, that should stamp duty be paid by the vendor, not the buyer. But what a sort of shift that would be to bring that in. And, you know, yeah, people might think it's a bad idea now if they're buying, but what happens if they've just bought and they've got to pay it again when they're selling, and, you know, so on and so forth. I can't see. I think it's here to stay, isn't it? And I think it's here to stay in its current format for some time. I couldn't see them, you know, increasing it in the current climate with everything else that's going up, because it could have a negative effect, but who knows?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? You know, but it's a cash cow. I think the broader problem for conveyancers actually is that stamp duty land tax has now just become so complex. It's just become, you know, the fodder of negligence claims, and I think that's the thing that actually, in reality, for coalface conveyancers and firms concerns me, is just the you know, the potential for errors.
Yeah, 100%. It's too complicated. You go back, you know, a period of time, and it used to be that it was purely based on consideration, and that equaled what you paid. You've now got multiple dwelling relief. You know, you've now got different scenarios if you're, you know, overseas buyer. You know, if you're sort of buying to replace a house that you're living in, you know, there's so many different permutations now that go into calculating what's, you know, stamp duty should be, that, as you say, it's got too complicated. And, you know, I think we discussed before, it's really in the remit of an accountant more than a conveyancer.
Yeah, I completely agree. So perhaps moving on, Stu, I mean, we did talk a few weeks ago, and probably just to keep on sort of just again in more general terms in terms of what's going in the market, there was a suggestion that the lenders, the Bank of England mortgage affordability test for lenders when they're looking at you know, buyers you know, ability to pay a mortgage as part of the sort of agreement process, that mortgage affordability test might be dropped. I think that's certainly still on the agenda. I mean, maybe some of our mortgage broker friends can bring us up to date on that, but I think I worry that I worry that it might cause people to overstretch themselves. But maybe the other side of that coin is if the market slows down later in the years, to having some of those restrictions removed to enable people to purchase, on the other side of the coin, might not be a bad idea. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. It'd be handy to have something sort of up your sleeve to try and stimulate the market if there was a dip. But again, it just sounds to me like we're going back to sort of that sort of, was it 2007, 2008 era, where all of a sudden everything crashed, and a lot of that was to do with the fact that people were sort of overspending, or affordability wasn't there, and banks were still lending with their 100% and 110% mortgages. Just seems to be a bit of a throwback to that day.
Yeah, I mean, well, maybe to link to another piece of news that came out this month, Stu, the Halifax produced a report, again, perhaps for our sort of agent and sort of letting friends that watch, and the headline from that, Stu, was that buying apparently is now £1,400 a year cheaper than renting, according to, as I say, a recent report by the Halifax. But that's not really the point, is it? In real terms, I think.
Yeah, I don't see what we can gain from that kind of stat anyway. At the end of the day, I think it's what people want, isn't it? People want to buy; they don't want to rent. But
if you're paying a very high rent, how are you ever going to save for a deposit?
Exactly. That's the issue. But again, it's all about demand, isn't it? I think the demand for rental properties is there. That's the key. And of course, that means the rents organically then become higher, don't they?
Yeah, exactly. So what else have you seen in the sort of news this month, Stu, that's caught your eye for our conveyancer friends?
Well, maybe one of the bigger ones, but obvious, was probably the inflation rising. You know, we sort of touched on it earlier, didn't we? But it's a 30-year, is it a 30-year high?
Yeah.
We're talking now 6.2%. So, you know, going back to the cost of living, you know, if there is a potential for a market dip, you know, you would think, wouldn't you, that, you know, the cost of living at the moment with the fuel prices, oil, stuff like that, it's, you know, it's getting to a point where it's not insignificant. I think we discussed before that, you know, various rises, you know, maybe wouldn't have an impact, but it's you know, it's getting heavy out there now, isn't it? You know, the cost of fuel now is really expensive, isn't it? So I think, you know, with your sort of energy bills going up and whatnot, you know, it could have a material effect at some point later this year.
Yeah, I mean, I think people will get out their prams about interest rates creeping up, but I think we do need to remember that interest rates have now crept up to 0.75%, but of course that is still less than 1% in terms of bank, you know, the interest rates, and I do think we need to just be quite careful about that and keep hold of that. I mean, again, I don't want to keep saying we've said before, but nobody, you know, very few people working in the conveyancing sphere now, Stu, will remember when interest rates were 15%.
Yeah.
I mean, one tiny thing that I think is particularly relevant for conveyancers that they need to look out for is in fact the Law Society's interest rate that we obviously quote in our contract, the contract rate of interest. That's the penalty rate of interest that applies in the event of late completion. Lots of people, instead of putting perhaps, you know, 4 or 5% above, you know, Barclays base rate or whatever, will quote the Law Society's rate. Well, if ever you do have a late completion, and perhaps if the market tightens up a bit, you're going to get more of them. Always go to the Law Society's. If you just Google Law Society's interest rate, it will take you to the sort of table of those interest rates, the Law Society's interest rate over the years, and always make sure you're applying the correct rate, because as rates are creeping up, the Law Society's interest rate similarly will creep up. So do just watch out for that. It's one of those tiny points, but if you're calculating the contract rate on something for late completion, you want to be applying the correct percentage, which is. Are you
one of those, Lorraine, that knocks the percentage back? You see 5% in there, do you knock it back to 4%? In the grand scheme of things, when we do that, are we doing it out of a matter of habit, or?
I think, to be fair, 4 or 5%, I've always said to people on my training courses is acceptable, you know, and I wouldn't get, particularly with interest rates so low, I wouldn't get particularly aerated about it, particularly, quite frankly, if I had very little else to say. I've got to say, it's not something I would get overly aerated about, Stu. You know, but if I'm making a point, I can't say I've never done it, mate. Let's put it like that. Can't say I've never knocked it back.
It always makes me laugh when I see something, there's a middle name missing or something significant, yes. But they've still spotted the 5% and made it 4%. And I think, in the grand scheme of things, when the proverbial is in the fan.
Do you resist that? Do you resist that amendment?
Hell
That's
yes.
what I want to know. Are you there with your Viking helmet and your Viking stick, saying no, I'm gonna defend my 5% contract rate?
I think to myself, in the grand scheme of things, when that client's not moving and all the proverbials flying around, I'm really not sure that the 5 or the 4% is going to come into play.
No, exactly. On 3 days late completion.
Yeah.
I have to say, there was a chat because I mean, there's nothing more irritating than a pedant, is there, Stu? But of course, there's nothing more irritating than a pedant who's correct. And there used to be this gentleman practicing on the East Coast somewhere in the days of fax in particular. And as you know, the time for completion in the contract is 2 p.m. But if we all get to sort of 4 p.m. on a Friday and everybody's where they should be, we all sort of take a big sigh of relief. 5 p.m. probably these days. We all breathe a sigh of relief and think, thank goodness, that's a Friday over. Well, what you used to get with this chap is you'd hear the fax whirring into action at about 4:15, and his very sort of oldie worldy, logo at the top, and it would spew off and would say, well, as completion is after 2 p.m. in accordance with standard condition, whatever, actually we've calculated that interest at the contract rate is this, and your client owes us, you know, £22.38p. And you just think, oh God. But of course, actually, the annoying thing, of course, is that he was right. And that's what I mean about this. But nothing more annoying than a pedant who's right. But yeah. I did in fairness, in practice, Stu always used to think, my goodness me, this gentleman just doesn't have quite enough to do.
Yeah. But it's interesting, when we talk about times in contracts, how many people sort of really look at those, especially where there's a chain?
Yeah, they don't.
And I often see these contracts, I think, hang on a minute, you know, I bet that's not been looked at or, you know, taken into account on the actual day. I suppose the difficulty isn't on the day, and it's a hard one to explain to a client, isn't it, that, you know, there is a contractual time that completion must take place by, but actually you've probably got a 50-50 chance that it will be. It might go on longer than that. We can't actually tell you.
But as I say, if you're all just where you need to be by 5 p.m, consider it a win. You're
okay, yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Anyway, so what else? Conveyancing timeframes, of course. I mean, you know, mention it because it's been a bit of news. Haven't improved at all. So the amount of time that transactions are taking has been reported, and as we've just mentioned, of course, we're, you know, still busy on that. But Stu, you know, one important point I would come back to, as I say, for our lovely conveyancing friends, is, you know, the very topical, important issue of the sanctions. So, yeah. Stu, you know, do you want to mention a bit about that?
Yeah, well, it's obviously something that's not going away and is going to grow and grow, isn't it? We've obviously done a chat on this before, so if anyone's listening or watching today and hasn't seen one of our previous videos, please do go back and take a peek, because we do sort of cover this quite in depth, don't we? In terms of sort of how it's going to affect us now and in the future, and what checks we should all be doing. But yeah, it's I suppose to be, you know, kind of sort of average phrase, it's getting worse, isn't it? The numbers are going to go up, and therefore the importance of identifying this on the ID checks that we do has never been more prevalent, has it?
Yeah, exactly. And again, for those that don't know, you know, sanctions is almost a sort of, you know, a side road really off, you know, or a subheading of your broad sort of AML, your anti-money laundering issues, really. But, you know, it is fast moving. The government is updating the sanctions list. You've got to make sure you're not acting for people on it. You've got to make sure you know where money's coming from, particularly, you know, Russian money, quite frankly. The government added a further sort of 64 people to the sanctions list just this last week. And actually, I'm pleased to say, Stu, you did mention the chat that we did only a couple of weeks ago on this, and we did do a handout to sort of supplement the chat, which is on the Conveyancing Matters website. We'll, you know, stick the link to that chat on this video. But actually, the nice thing, because the handout's got quite a lot of contact details and, you know, other useful information on it, and actually quite a few people have said, oh, thanks very much for the handout, you know, it was really helpful, la 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 la. So, you know, that's nice. It's nice that it's helping people in practice, which of course was the point. So what else do you want to mention, Stu?
What else have we got? Trying to think now. Can you hit me with something? I'm running out of content.
Well, again, probably allied to that, just a sort of watch this space for conveyancers, really, Stu. The Economic Crime Act got the royal assent, meaning that it's kind of on the statute books, but it's not all in force yet. And really, you know, jury's out. The idea is, again, that this is, you know, supposed to be, you know, another part of the sort of government's sort of trying to, well, frankly, many would say probably close the door after the horse has bolted, really, in terms of us finding out where money's coming from, particularly looking behind the veil of limited companies, beneficial owners, all of that sort of thing. Some of that's going to be retrospective, so I think that will be difficult for firms. So that's a real watch this space. So if I was saying to conveyancers, I don't think we know the extent to which it's going to impact on what we do every day yet. But if I was going to advise conveyancers to keep an eye on anything and the Economic Crime Act coming in and the impact on our due diligence, I would say very much keep an eye on that, I've got to say, because I think I just think the jury's out on the extent to which it's going to impact on us, but it's clearly going to, is the reality. And of course, the dreaded old ground rent scenario. We've, you know, talked about this before, but The Leasehold Reform Ground Rent Act 2022, that's also got royal assent, Stu, but it's not all in force yet. So again, that's another real watch this space.
Watch this space, that's it.
Yeah. Again, going to reduce ground rents to a peppercorn on basically, new leases. But of course, Stu, it doesn't deal with the millions of existing leases that are already.
Well, that's the problem. A lot of the new leases now we don't have to worry about, because I think a lot of developers and landlords and sellers are acclimatized to this issue, aren't they?
Yeah.
So the problem are the ones that are in existence already.
Yeah, I think, and also what some commentators have said, which I think is a very good point, actually, isn't it? Is that even in the same sort of block, you could essentially get a sort of two-tier approach to leases, some of which have been sold off, which do have ground rents, perhaps of some substance, and then the sort of next tranche that don't, that have been with commencement dates after the date of the act, and so you could almost get a sort of two-tier market for for essentially flats in the same block, really, because those that got the ground rent provisions, sellers might feel they've got to sort of decrease the price of them to actually sell the properties, which is a very bizarre but probably quite likely sort of side effect, really, of the act. So that's another one really to keep an eye on, I would say. Couple of other tiny things, really, but I think just relevant to sort of point our colleagues to the Land Registry's updated Practice Guide 65, in case anyone's interested on rent charges, the dreaded old rent charges. It doesn't, Stu, sort of affect our conveyancers' issues around Section 121 enforcement of rent charges and Roberts and Lawton and all the rest of it, but it's absolutely, I think, still worth practitioners going and having a look at it, because it's been quite a they've renamed it, and it's quite an update on what the Land Registry's requirements are if you're registering a rent charge. So worth a look, I would say. And also, while we're on with the Land Reg, again, a sort of tiny but I think sort of significant one for a few, so you don't get your your registrations rejected. They've also updated Practice Guide 6. So it's one of these little tiny sort of esoteric points, Stu, but if a document appointing personal representatives was obtained outside the UK, obviously conferring authority on the PRs to sell a property, for example, that's not acceptable to the Land Reg unless it's been resealed by a court in the UK. So maybe a tiny point, but nonetheless one that's worth looking at. Yeah, because again, if we can avoid stubbing our toe on these tiny things and getting our registrations out, then so much the better, really. So anything else you want to mention, Stu, or do we?
No, I think that's it, really, isn't it? I think we sort of summed up March in a quick whirlwind.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Stu, lovely to chat as ever. Hopefully anybody that hasn't subscribed will be doing so. I can do my rubbish pointing either down here or up here, down here, and I still have my pajama bottoms on. So I'll see you really soon, Stu. You take care now.
Yeah, take care, Lorraine. See ya.
Bye.